Okay, I know. Wait, don't go. I know, it's been a while. I know I have abandoned you guys, it feels like, but I can explain. Okay? Well, not really. But I will say this. Life has been real. I've even changed my entire setup, and a lot has happened since we last spoke. So please get into this video. Let's do a little bit of a catch up and get into my new interest, I guess. Yeah. See you guys.
Hey, welcome back. You're back.
Are you listening? Damn.
Bring those lights out. But hey guys, welcome back. It is your girl Tando, and I am Media Mom. Guys, it has been so long since I last did a video that I honestly felt so awkward coming back, but I knew I had to come back, especially because on the 1st of Jan, guys, I got a new subscriber, and I was like, you know what? Don't give up. Don't give up. And I wasn't even giving up. I think I just got very overwhelmed with a lot of things last year. For example, like I said in the intro, I've changed my setup, so I've changed where I'm recording, and you'll see there's this little black thing over here. It was where my TV used to live. I don't have a TV anymore. So like a lot has changed. A lot has changed in my environment. A lot has changed with me. And yeah, if you are interested in catching up with me, I am posting more on TikTok, so you can catch me there. Same name, Media Mom, or YT Media Mom. You can find me on TikTok, and yeah, I'm talking over there as well about other random things, but more mom things. But yeah, anyway, it has been a while. I am so sorry. I know. Just let it out. Let it out.
Boo,
Okay.
Wendy.
Okay.
Boo, Wendy, Fatty Burger. Boo.
I do have a new topic, just going back into where I have been and what has been going on. You know, I have spoken about it briefly before. My daughter is on the spectrum. She is neurodivergent. So a lot of things come with that in terms of routines and just having life organized in a certain way to manage and help her with everything. So she's just started now with grade R today, and it's the first day back at work. So it's a lot of things that have been happening in preparation for today and all of that. But as I got into like momville and just locking down and all of that, the topic around neurodiversity really started to pop up and become like a focus point, like a hyperfixation of sorts. So I wanted to do a video dedicated to that hyperfixation. And the topic then will be around neurodiversity in Black media and how it is represented. Because I started to think about it and I was like, you know, we all kind of had those quirky friends that was like a little strange, but like, you know, we let them be. And I feel like I was that for a lot of people, but that's a whole different topic. So I just was like, how have neurodivergent people been represented in Black media? And maybe that also can tell us a lot about why it is perceived the way it is today, why there may not be as much awareness, especially looking at it from a South African lens. And I just really wanted to unpack all of that. And I hope this video does that for you guys and maybe also spark some conversation or even inspire more people to have the conversations around neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, all of these things in Black communities in the South African context. But anyway, before I digress, I will be referring to my notes because, as you can tell, my thoughts do wander, and I want to kind of try and keep things concise and precise because that is a challenge, but we're working on it. But yeah, let's get into this topic and let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe. I think that one subscriber has inspired me. I am aiming for 100 subscribers, guys. 100 subscribers would be something worth celebrating. I have no idea what we'll celebrate with, but if we can get to 100 subscribers, I think we can do something fun. Maybe we go live. I don't know. I'm kidding. I don't think I have the capacity to go live. But anyway, let's get into the topic. I'm babbling. Let's go. Inspire more people. Okay, I'm gonna try something here. I've moved my notes here. Okay, that works. So, like I said, guys, this topic is something that lives at the intersection of me working in advertising and media and being a mom to a child who is neurodivergent, right? So, I started to wonder and really think about this. When we think about neurodiversity today, this language that we use is very new, right? In the past, we didn't hear people talking about autism or talking about neurodiversity and neurotypical people. We mostly heard people talking about, oh, that kid's a bit naughty, or they're a bit slow, or they talk too much. In fact, I've heard that one personally a couple of times, or the boy just doesn't listen, or that girl is a little bit too sensitive. Again, another one. But these labels never really explained anything about these kids or these people. They more so labeled them as being disobedient or misbehaving. But now, as awareness kind of rises, you know, the language starts to evolve with people. And we're starting to use words like neurodiversity. We're starting to introduce terms like autism, Asperger's, and different terms that speak to what neurodiversity is. And again, it is a spectrum when we're speaking about neurodiversity. And I think a lot of people may start to misunderstand other people's expressions of neurodiversity because it doesn't fit a particular box, or it doesn't look like somebody you know who fits a particular box or who has received a diagnosis. So it is such a broad term as well, so it makes it very difficult to hard and fasten the language around what neurodiversity is. But I think it's worth looking at the media landscape and how we have seen Black people represented as quirky, as awkward, and as strange characters, when actually what was being told to us was they were neurodivergent, but we will take them for who they are and just kind of brush off those little quirks, and leave it at that, right? So, and again, I forgot my notes. So again, raising a child who processes and experiences the world so differently from other people, and going back into the media that I grew up watching, and realizing that we're actually surrounded by a lot of neurodivergent people, and this is also matched by the fact that we're seeing a spike in the diagnosis of neurodivergence, especially when you look at women. Now, this is interesting because if we look at the history of how autism, ADHD, ADD, and all of these neurodiverse conditions have been diagnosed in the past, the criteria did not match a diverse population, right? So, in order to understand why, you have to look at how the research behind neurodiversity started, right? When autism and ADHD were first documented, the profile was narrowly defined. It was looked at through the lens of white, male, middle to upper class individuals. So usually a stay-at-home mom would notice through monitoring their behaviors and bringing concerns to the doctors. So again, this is the luxury of having a parent at home who is able to observe the different changes or lack of changes in behavior, and having access to resources like medical aid or medical access, in order to then have somebody go and re-look all of these things. And I think about it, even in my own scenario, I think the best thing that happened for us was the fact that I started working remotely because of COVID, and she was born shortly before COVID. So I went from maternity leave, 1 month in the office, and then lockdown. So I've been at home, and even though I work full time and also have been a student part time, I was able to be present to notice and monitor her behavior over time, in order to ascertain whether she needed an evaluation or not. However, to be fair, a lot of the things that she had done or were doing didn't seem that strange to me. So what also helped was having people around me who were like, I know somebody who's on the spectrum, and no one actually said directly, you should have her checked, but everyone would always say they know someone and kind of pause, and kind of leave room for me to fill in the gaps. And eventually it clicked, and now we're here, right? Cool. So again, resources are very important when we're speaking about this, and when we look at it from a South African lens, you start to understand how being a Black South African in apartheid South Africa would have been made it more difficult for children who are on the diversity spectrum or neurodiversity spectrum to be diagnosed and given the support that they need in order to thrive in a society that's honestly not built to support them, or in fact give them access, if you're being honest. But anyway, back to my notes, right? So this narrow window, this caused a shaping, it shaped the way diagnostics were done for neurodivergent individuals for decades. So for many, many years, this criteria being based on white males of upper and middle class, that criteria of how they presented their neurodiversity became the criteria. So if you did not match that particular way of expressing it, you then would fall through the cracks, evidently, right? So if you were, for example, a girl or Black, like I mentioned, or poor, or living in a community where mental health, for example, is not a priority, then you were invisible. And this is the sad reality that you see in South Africa, where a lot of children on the spectrum are kind of isolated to just living and existing in their homes. The entire environment becomes their homes because it becomes so difficult to exist outside in society when people firstly don't understand why your child is screaming. Yes, she's happy, she's excited. I know it sounds like torture, but they don't understand how it presents, and therefore that also brings shame and causes parents to self-isolate, just to firstly provide safety for their children, and also some sense of dignity, because the constant shaming and finger pointing and staring from society also makes it difficult for you to live in the world when you constantly have people looking at you. But anyway, but yeah, so instead of a diagnosis, a lot of these times these kids were met with punishments. So again, like I said before, these kids have been labeled as either slow or disobedient, talking too much, or whatever these labels they are given, being too naughty. this causes parents, adults, and parental figures around them to approach them with more disciplinary action as opposed to support and understanding and compassion. When what they really needed in that moment was possibly just a change of environment into a low stimulating environment, where maybe a mall or whatever other environment may have been too overstimulating for them. And instead of support, like I said, you were met with shame, and understanding was not something that you're often given when you're living in society. And a lot of people will give you. I remember one person telling me the reason Willow doesn't speak is because I don't speak vernac to her, and I was like, well, that's a very big assumption that you're making just because you're not hearing me speak vernac right now to her. But anyway, and it is those misconceptions again that make it difficult for you to integrate in the world around you. But anyway, this is why again you find so many black families of black people, especially women, um, using this language of neurodiversity very late in life. And we're seeing it now on the internet. And a lot of people might cringe when you start to see those content about late diagnosed women or people just talking about their diagnosis and how that feels and that experience. I know a lot of people find it cringe, but then it is happening because there is more awareness now. And I actually want to do a little quick search, but I'll include that later on in the video. Just looking at a Google Trend search of how much more the conversations around neurodivergency have spiked following COVID 19 and all of that. And because of that isolation, again, parents were now forced to sit with their kids, right, in the house, do the homework with them, and all of the things the teachers were telling them, they can't ignore it at this point. When the teacher told them, your kid don't sit still, now they can't ignore it. So now you start to search the symptoms, you start to investigate, you start to deep dive, and that's where the spike in, that also feeds into the spike in diagnosis that we're getting now. Also, adults now getting out of the routines that they had kind of masked themselves into. When you're isolated in your house, you start to unmask, which is again part of this new language or lexicon that we are embracing with this rise of awareness. When you are unmasking, meaning all of the things you've learned to hide, the behaviors you've learned to hide, now come to the forefront, and all the things you've learned to do to kind of be accepted by society falls away. And in those moments, that's when people start to now unpack and start to realize, oh snap, maybe I haven't been struggling because I am just lazy and don't know how to function as a human. Maybe I actually don't know how to function as a human. Maybe that's the reason. But anyway, I need to bring myself back to the point. Tanda, you have a script for a reason. Anyway, so essentially what I'm saying is historically the diagnostic criteria for any neurodivergent condition excluded a lot of people. And that's why we're seeing this huge spike. I will include a screenshot somewhere. Gross. Comparing just the trends. ADD still is top preference or biggest topic that people are searching about, but then we are seeing more search queries for neurodiversity, more for autism spectrum disorder specifically, as well as ADHD being I guess ADD has been phased out. We're now just saying ADHD. It's a more wider umbrella including ADD. But yes, anyway, the hyperactivity sometimes is not external, it's sometimes internal, and that loud voice in the back of your mind that doesn't keep quiet. Anyway, I digress. So again, neurodivergence appeared, but it was disguised. It was disguised as bad behavior. It was disguised as quirkiness and disguised under different labels that enforced disciplinary action against children and people who honestly just needed additional support. So not necessarily giving people clinical labels, but giving them more personality quirks, as I said, being weird, annoying, or being a little too smart. And I know this one is very interesting because I remember in high school hearing people who talk about really intelligent kids, and this was particularly around Black people when I was in public school, where they'll be like, "Daman ke kreke," like, "Wala thata," and "Hoka wala thata," you'll end up going crazy, essentially. Like, that was a thing. And if you think about it in the context of neurodivergence, diversity, as well as, hyperfixations, right? If you get so interested in a topic, you get so consumed by it, if you're on the spectrum, you get so hyperfixated that it becomes your identity to some extent. Like, Sheldon and trains, yes, it becomes an extension of who you are. And that phrase or that term or that saying always makes me think back to that. It's essentially they are pointing out kids who hyperfixated on their educational topic, whether it was a certain subject, so much, and labeling their stims and other expressions of their neurodivergency as them kind of losing their sanity. If you think about it that way, We've always known that neurodivergent children, or these really smart children, had a brain that just functioned a little differently. We just didn't have the language to articulate it in the best way. Anyway, back to the point. This is where the analysis will begin. I will include those screenshots. I think this is a good time to do that, and then go into the next phase of this conversation, which will be the characters. Now, I'm going to look at US-based content to kind of unpack these Black characters who represent neurodiversity. But then I would like you to also participate in the conversation, and maybe let's look at some local examples. Give me some local examples that you can think of, and that could be a follow-up video if this even goes anywhere, somewhere. Gross. Comparing just the trends. ADD still is top preference or biggest topic that people are searching about, but then we are seeing more search queries for neurodiversity, more for autism spectrum disorder specifically, as well as ADHD being I guess ADD has been phased out. We're now just saying ADHD. It's a more wider umbrella, including ADD. But yes, anyway, the hyperactivity sometimes is not external, it's sometimes internal, and that loud voice in the back of your mind that doesn't keep quiet. Anyway, I digress. So again, neurodivergence appeared, but it was disguised. It was disguised as bad behavior. It was disguised as quirkiness, and disguised under different labels that enforced disciplinary action against children and people who honestly just needed additional support. So, not necessarily giving people clinical labels, but giving them more personality quirks, as I said, being weird, annoying, or being a little too smart. And I know this one is very interesting because I remember in high school hearing people who talk about really intelligent kids, and this was particularly around Black people when I was in public school, where they'll be like, daman ke kreke, like, wala thata, and hoka wala thata, you'll end up going crazy, essentially. Like, that was a thing. And if you think about it in the context of neurodivergence, diversity, as well as, hyperfixations, right? If you get so interested in a topic, you get so consumed by it, if you're on the spectrum, you get so hyperfixated that it becomes your identity to some extent. Like, Sheldon and trains? Yes. It becomes an extension of who you are. And that phrase or that term or that saying always makes me think back to that. It's essentially they are pointing out kids who hyperfixated on their educational topic, whether it was a certain subject, so much, and labeling their stims and other expressions of their neurodivergency as them kind of losing their sanity. If you think about it that way, we've always known that neurodivergent children, or these really smart children, had a brain that just functioned a little differently. We just didn't have the language to articulate it in the best way. Anyway, back to the point. This is where the analysis will begin. I will include those screenshots. I think this is a good time to do that, and then go into the next phase of this conversation, which will be the characters. Now, I'm going to look at US-based content to kind of unpack these Black characters who represent neurodiversity. But then I would like you to also participate in the conversation, and maybe let's look at some local examples. Give me some local examples that you can think of, and that could be a follow-up video if this even goes anywhere, somewhere. Gross. Comparing just the trends. ADD still is top preference or biggest topic that people are searching about, but then we are seeing more search queries for neurodiversity, more for autism spectrum disorder specifically, as well as ADHD being I guess ADD has been phased out. We're now just saying ADHD. It's a more wider umbrella, including ADD. But yes, anyway, the hyperactivity sometimes is not external, it's sometimes internal, and that loud voice in the back of your mind that doesn't keep quiet. Anyway, I digress. So again, neurodivergence appeared, but it was disguised. It was disguised as bad behavior. It was disguised as quirkiness, and disguised under different labels that enforced disciplinary action against children and people who honestly just needed additional support. So, not necessarily giving people clinical labels, but giving them more personality quirks, as I said, being weird, annoying, or being a little too smart. And I know this one is very interesting because I remember in high school hearing people who talk about really intelligent kids, and this was particularly around Black people. Okay, so my bad. So let's get into the characters because like I said, let's look at Black media and how they have represented neurodivergent characters. And I do need to give this disclaimer: I am labeling them as neurodivergent. They have not been expressed or communicated to be neurodivergent, but just looking at some quirks and understanding how stereotypes work in media, I'm just going to make the educated assumption that these are characters that were meant to represent neurodivergent individuals, but they were more emphasis was placed on their quirks, labeling them as quirky as opposed to recognizing the actual medical diagnosis underlying all the behavior or quirks. Okay, cool. So let's start with the first one. And I feel like you can't have this conversation without bringing him up because Steve Urkel, did I do that? This character for me was the Sheldon for Black people. Like he was the closest equivalent to Sheldon that we have for Black people in terms of characters and how this person is expressed. And I say this again, noting that Sheldon always tells us in Big Bang that his parents had him tested. There's nothing wrong with them. He says this over and over again, and I think in Young Sheldon they even make a reference to this where we see him getting tested with his sister, his twin sister, and they realize that she has like exceptional social awareness, where Sheldon lacked social awareness but was like really good at math and all the other stuff, right? And the focus for that episode ended up being around his sister's social awareness as opposed to what was the findings of Sheldon's analysis. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Sheldon. We're talking about Black people in Black media. So Urkel. Steve Urkel is one of those characters where he had the suspenders, the nasal voice, and all these inventions that he created. And these traits today would ring every neurodivergent bell in your body. Hyperfocus, social awkwardness, sensory obliviousness, emotional dysregulation. But the 90s were different. The language was very different back then. So instead of saying that he's neurodivergent, the show kind of used his difference as a point of humor. They used it as a way for people to just kind of adults roll their eyes at the things that he would do, and kids avoiding him, which is again a very relatable part of neurodiversity. And his brilliance being framed more as chaotic and never really gifted. And going back to the example I made, right? In the hood, they say if you read too much, you're gonna lose your mind. And that's essentially what he represented. He represented this person who's so smart, but then his smart was crazy. It was not celebrated as something good, but rather as just chaos instead. And the mask shows up when we start to see his alter ego. Ooh, Stefan before him. But anyway, my bad. This is the opposite of him. This is where he starts to mask all of these neurodivergent traits, and he shows up as the smooth, socially acceptable version of himself, right? And many Black neurodivergent kids learn this very same lesson very early on, that being yourself means people get annoyed. So you need to mask, and that way people get relaxed, and you become more socially acceptable, and people want to hang out with you a lot more. And with that being said, I feel like an episode of Boondocks cannot be not mentioned in this video because Riley is the epitome of what would not fly in today's modern world. Like Riley, Riley is problematic, but we love him. We love him as a character. But there is an episode where it is a special education episode, right? And this is satire in a very sharp form because what we see in this episode is Riley, classic Riley behavior, making fun of special needs children. Then he very quickly gets humbled when they outperform him. And when I say outperform him, they outperform him in sports. Like they just do the most, and he realizes that yeah, they may be special ed, but there's something special about them too, you know? And it reflects the playground reality. And this episode really looks at how fear is disguised as humor and ignorance passed down without any questioning. These portrayals of the special ed episode with Riley, as well as what we see with Steve Urkel, they aren't necessarily malicious, but they are products of a world that didn't have the language, the vocabulary to really articulate what was happening and who these children were. And I think that episode for me was one of my favorite episodes of Boondocks because I love how quickly he gets humbled at the end of it and realizes they ain't ones to play with. They really are not the ones to play with. And then moving on, you get characters who are the mislabeled as defiant. And I spoke about this earlier in the video, where a lot of the behaviors, traits that you'll see with children who are on the neurodivergence spectrum will be characterized as defiant. And this one, I know, again, I'm going to tiptoe around this one because I know it's based on a real person. And this person has not come out and said that they are neurodivergent. So I'm not going to try and label people, but I do want to like focus on how the character was portrayed, understanding that media, movies and programs tend to really lean on stereotypes and really emphasizing or inflating characteristics to get a point across, right? So I'm not saying this person is actually neurodivergent, but we're going to talk about it anyway. We were talking about Chris from Everybody Hates Chris, right? So he comes up as anxious, overthinking, hyper aware, and logical to a fault. And in any other context, somebody would look at Chris Rock's real childhood and say, this is a classic neurodivergent, sensitive, and pattern tracking individual, right? This is the classic signs and traits. But in the show and in many Black homes, the behavior is read more as, why are you like this? Like, it's framed more as survival and uh, being neurotic. It's a quirk, like we said. And that's how neurodivergent Black kids often go through life and slip through the cracks, because their coping strategies often look like a personality trait and not necessarily a symptom. And it goes back to that hypervigilance. When you are aware, I'm very aware that you're not experiencing and going through life in the same way that other people typically do, you become very hyper aware of yourself and your environment, because you know that when you act or behave a certain way, it triggers people in a negative way, and you don't want a negative response. So therefore, you become very hyper aware on what triggers people to respond negatively, so that you never become the trigger yourself. Just seeking acceptance in society and all of that beautiful stuff, right? So what these characters really treat us, again, just looking at everything in totality, is it's something very uncomfortable, and it's that Black neurodivergent oftentimes gets labeled as attitude. And I immediately think about that interview with on Club Shay Shay with Amanda Seales, where a lot of people pushed back on what Amanda Seales was saying. But if you ask people who are neurodivergent, and particularly Black people who are neurodivergent, what she said was true. And the response she got tracks. Because the moment you start to show up as authentically as possible and be honest about your experiences, it makes people uncomfortable. I can think of many times I've gone back and forth with teachers, lecturers about concepts that I was very passionate about, and I felt that they probably did not want to unpack the conversation as far as I wanted to. For the sake of the group, they're like, okay, let's leave it at that. But I'm like, wait, let's dig a little deeper. And I think that's what it was. But anyway, let me not. The script exists for a reason. All right, guys, it seems something went wrong with my initial recording. But anyway, when looking at the quiet acceptance characters, here we're looking at difference as normal. Here we get to see neurodivergence not necessarily being named, but it's treated as difference with a gentle, touch. Sinclair, for example, from Living Single. She is the quirky, dreamy, creative one. Nobody kind of forces her to be smaller in her character. She is celebrated and embraced as she is, and it isn't something highlighted or even deemed as problematic. Then you also get Gerald from Hey Arnold. Here he is the character that navigates social systems with this quiet intelligence and emotional depth, again showing contrast to what was previously thought as a trait of neurodivergence as being closed off or emotionally distant. Here we're seeing a different depiction where he has emotional depth and very quiet emotional intelligence. And then finally, I think this was just an honorary mention, Donkey from Shrek. Yes, Donkey is a donkey and not a person, but the voice character is black, so I will deem Donkey black. But anyway, this is the typical character that you think of when you think of ADHD. It is the talkative, impulsive, loyal, and really delightful character. This character is the epitome of too much. And it's not seen as a flaw as much as Shrek may get exhausted and annoyed by him. He still loves him, and their bond and connection and friendship is unmatched in the movie. But yeah, these characters do something very subtle. they allow neurodivergent coded behavior without bringing any shame to the characters. And I think that's a really nice spin to how we can view personas, characters that represent diversity in different personalities and phenotypes. So, what does this all mean for us? It really just means that our generation, if you're a millennial, I guess Gen Z ish, some, and anyone before millennial, you grew up either laughing at what we didn't understand or mildly relating to it. But we essentially just absorbed stereotypes that came from a diagnostic system that never really included us in the very first place. And I'm speaking to those who were not included in the initial diagnostic criteria of neurodivergence. And that's a very wide range of individuals if you've been paying attention. And now, with more language and more awareness, we're revisiting the stories that we grew up with and realizing how many of our kids and how many of us were actually neurodivergent coded ourselves. We just didn't have the terminology. We felt different. We felt the difference. We lived it and we recognized it in characters who didn't fit neatly anywhere. They kind of were always, like I said, quirky. They were different, but still celebrated. And we related to those characters because, again, there was an acceptance from the masses to those personas. And now, as adults, we are raising the next generation and we get to rewrite that script, right? We get to break the myths, expand the language, as well as teach our kids that difference doesn't have to be defended and it can be understood, supported, as well as celebrated all at once. So, this is again my first video for 2026, guys. I hope you genuinely enjoyed it, and I did do a little speed up in my video because I realized that I pause a lot in between, especially when it's free flow thought. So I try to speed it up and try to condense everything. Tell me what you think of the changes, and like I said earlier, please don't forget to subscribe, guys. 100 subscribers. Also, tell me, can you think of any like local examples of neurodivergent coded characters that we may have missed, that we didn't pay attention to? And let's continue the conversation, guys. Let's continue the conversation because, yeah, I think it's a conversation worth having. I hope you guys have a lovely day and don't forget to lead with love. It is your girl, Tando, and I am Media Mom. Bye. So, what does this all mean for us?